So there's a lot in the Bible about sheep and shepherds. So much so that reading the Bible, one would begin to think that there are lessons to be learned there. That perhaps one of the associations is that people are like sheep. If you've ever felt a little sheepish, now you know why. Jesus talks about sheep and shepherds in John chapter 10. He speaks about himself as the shepherd, the gate of the sheep, who lays down his life. In those times, a shepherd might be out at a sheep corral or at one improvised out of rocks and bushes, leaving an opening. And the shepherd would lay down in the gate to sleep, and in that way block predators from harming the sheep in the fold. So when Jesus says he lays down his life for us, it's an image of protection and care. In that same chapter 10, Jesus talks about the shepherd's intimate knowledge of the sheep, that the sheep recognize the tone of the shepherd's voice and will follow him wherever he goes. Shepherds in those times also gave sheep the gift of individuality. They spent a lot of time with them, so they came to recognize distinguishing characteristics and would name each one. The sheep would recognize not only the tone of the shepherd's voice, but they would recognize the name by which they were called, so an individual sheep would come at the master's beckoning. I like this a lot because it speaks of the individual love that God in Christ has for each of us and our opportunity to have a personal relationship with him. So that we're more than just a mass entity. We're not really completely like sheep. We each have the opportunity to be individuals. If sheep can do that, I think people can probably do that as well. If we don't want to be like sheep, then perhaps we should think about avoiding just doing what everybody else does. Here's an amusing story. My wife and I are fond of cycling. We have a tandem road cycle, and we're quite often out on the road having adventures. When we lived in eastern Idaho, we had a particular route that we would take that took us across the high desert into some of the areas where shepherds would pasture their sheep. One day, we were on our way up a highway, and we came to a place where there were a lot of droppings in the road. We, being people who live in the woods and wilderness, like to think that we can figure out what kind of animal has passed by based on what it's left behind. We'd never seen anything like this before. We're picking our way around these lumps of dark matter and can't really tell what creature had created this mass pile of refuse on the road. It wasn't until we got around the next corner and the next hill when we saw the massive herd of sheep that we realized where all this had come from. But the funny thing is, it seemed like all of the sheep went at the same time. It was just massive. It's like they were crossing the road and somebody in the midst of the flock said, "It's time to go," and everybody did. I suppose people are something like that. We shouldn't be. Just because somebody says it's time to do something, we shouldn't all just do it. We should be individuals. I hope you find that mildly amusing. Something else we learned as we were in this flock of sheep is that there is a role for a guardian in a flock of sheep. And Jesus mentions this in John chapter 10 as well, that there is a guard posted at the door and will let the master in, but will not let anybody else in. We had to stop on our ride because we found ourselves in the midst of an enormous flock of sheep. We couldn't go forward or backward. We were right in the midst of them. As we enjoyed this proximity to the sheep, we also noticed that there were other animals amidst the sheep that were not sheep. Wouldn't have recognized it at first. Large white dogs, approximately sheep-sized, approximately sheep-colored, walking along very much like sheep, but obviously guard dogs. We had stopped in one of these very large Hungarian-type dogs, that's the breed, it stopped and gave us a very, very intense stare. I think these dogs, if they've had sunglasses on, would pass for Secret Service agents. They were very intimidating. The dog was studying us to try to figure out what we were and if we were a threat to the flock. We decided not to look the dog in the eye, just to be quiet, chat, be friendly, and the dog pretty soon just melded back into the herd and went on its way and decided that we weren't, after all, a threat. These particular guardian dogs are raised with the sheep. The sheep are the animals that they live with and are familiar with. They sort of consider themselves a sheep, except they're not. They have the instincts of a protector. And one of my friends who comes from a family that does a lot of sheep herding and knows about dogs says that this particular breed has an interesting strategy for dealing with predators. If a coyote, for instance, would approach the herd, this very large sheep-like dog would come up to the coyote and then begin basically acting like a playful dog. It would try to engage the predator in social interaction, would try to play with it. The effect of this is that the predator is so weirded out and confused that it goes away. If the predator keeps coming, of course, the dog would get violent. But the first strategy is not to destroy the predator, but to try to socialize with it, try to make friends. As it was clear in the conversation, it just so weirds out the fox that they don't know what to do, and the sheep are protected that way. I like to think that the protectors in our lives are beneficent and gentle first, no need for lethal force. I kind of think that's God's strategy with all of us, even in protection. Those who prey upon us are not necessarily evil. Perhaps they need something that they're lacking as well. Well, as I say, the story of Jesus as a shepherd and we as sheep is not really so much about how people are sheep-like, but how Jesus is shepherd-like. Jesus is the good shepherd. He lays down his life for the sheep. He knows our names. He calls to us, and if we are familiar with him, we will hear his voice, and we will follow him. And it creates a wonderful relationship, a beautiful friendship, and as Jesus promised, that which he meant to bring to us, life more abundantly, or as another translation says, a rich and satisfying life. In our part of the world, there are many things that we equate with a good life: fine clothing, plenty of food, good-tasting wine, lots of wonderful music, being clean, having water to drink and to bathe in, having a safe environment in which to live, where war does not threaten us, having good health care, not being threatened by crippling diseases. In many places of the world, what we take for granted is not the reality where people live. Much of what we're called to do as Christians is to help out in these ways, not to make people into Americans necessarily, but to help provide for them the basic necessities of a rich life. But it isn't just about that. We could create a worldly utopia and have no place in it for God at all, which isn't the point that Jesus was making at all. The source of the abundant life is not the external things, as critical as they may be. The source of a quality of abundance and richness and satisfaction in life is a connection with God. And that is what Jesus brings to us. That is the power of the story of Jesus. It is the message that God cares about each of us, that life has meaning, and not just the comforts of life, but the hardships of life. In all of these things, we are known and loved by someone who understands all that we go through as human beings. When we come to know this God through Christ, we are on our way to experiencing what Jesus promised, life more abundantly. So I invite you to consider that on this day. How is your relationship with God? Are you paying more attention to the flock, people around you, or are you thinking for yourself? Are you listening for the Master's voice? Are you making him the primary object of affection in your life? Are you listening to what he says? Are you following him and seeking with all your heart to do what he wants you to do?